This 35th scale King Tiger tank from Rye Field Models has its 3-tone ambush camo scheme, and it's already looking nicely weathered after the chipping and grime coat process. But it's not quite ready for combat in the Battle of the Bulge just yet. It still needs a heavy dose of weathering to make it look realistic. Today, I'm going to show you the final steps for turning a model tank into a battle-worn behemoth that really looks like it's been through hell. The style of chipping that I use does a lot of the heavy lifting for weathering this tank. It creates some shade and shadows and helps give it a grimy look and feel, but that's not the last step in the weathering process, not even close. This is still going to need a pen wash to pull out the details, create shadow effects on the recessed lines and things like that. It's also going to need oil filters, highlights, help differentiate part of the tank with respect to light and give it some streaking effects. And it's also going to need some of the detail stuff like weathering the exhaust, metallic effects, things like that. And finally, because this is a tank that's in the Battle of the Bulge, it's going to get a heavy layer of dirt and mud. The pen wash is probably the most important step in any weathering process. I'm going to use oil paint, specifically black oil paint here. I know dark brown is sometimes preferred for German tanks with a yellow base and 3-tone camo, but I think the black does a better job here because of the dark iron paint that I use in the chipping grime coat process. And I'm just going to put it around the details, sunken panel lines, all those normal places where you're going to want that extra level of shadow and shading on a tank. And then once it dries to the touch, I'm going to come back with mineral spirits and clean it up. Pretty straightforward process. One of the questions I know a lot of beginning modelers have, I know I certainly did, is how do you thin oil paint to make a wash? Unfortunately, there's no recipe or specific ratio for it. You just kind of have to play around. What I did here was I put some of the black oil paint in a bottle cap and add a little thinner. And at first it was too thin, so I just added more paint until I got it to the consistency that I wanted to. And another thing too is even once you do get it to the consistency you want, you will have to keep adjusting it. That's kind of the downside of oil washes like this. The thinner evaporates, the ratio of paint to thinner changes as you use it, that kind of stuff. But since it's so easy to clean up oil paint, if you get the wrong consistency when you're applying it, you can always come back and clean it up immediately and adjust the consistency of your wash as needed. Once the pen wash is dry, and I really want to stress that because the next step in this weathering process is going to be further oil effects and some enamel effects too. You don't want to be spreading that on and using more thinner if your pen wash isn't dry, because then you're just going to end up wiping away your pen wash. All right, the first thing I'm going to do is do some highlighting on the top of the turret using oil dot filters. After it dries to the touch, I'm going to take a brush that's ever so slightly dampened with thinner and start pulling it down along with the slope of the surface. Use gravity as your guide on this one. It's okay to have some streaks. In fact, I think you want some streaks here. That kind of helps give it some of that rain mark effect, dirt and grime, etc., etc. While I'm on top of the turret, I'm also going to come in and add some more dark oil shading around the crew hatches. That just kind of helps represent where it gets dirty and beat up as the crew moves around, opens and closes doors, things like that. And I don't know that this step is all that accurate with these tanks, but it has a really cool effect, so I'm going to do it anyway, and that's adding oil and fuel stains to the cooling system vents on the side here. And what I'm doing is I've got black oil paint with a gloss medium in it. You want that gloss because that helps kind of make it a little bit more of a realistic look for oil and fuel stains. And then I'm just kind of spreading it around here and pulling it down the sides with a brush with a little bit of thinner on it. Once I do that, I'm going to come back and smush in some metal slag pigment in there to help give it some texture. And then I'll come back again and add a little bit more of that gloss medium to help kind of pull that glossy effect back out that the pigment sort of dampened in there. Another step that's probably not all that accurate with this tank, since it probably would have been a newer one that they just assigned to units in anticipation of the Battle of the Bulge, are rusty exhaust pipes. Again, it's just a super cool looking effect, and it's not hard to do, and it gives your tank a little bit of extra pop to it. So I painted it a dark gray base coat. I came back and added chips of white, which represent corrosion, and also some chips of dark yellow that represent the original color of the tank. From there, I added 2 different enamel rust washes, the light rust effect as well as the streaking rust effect. And I leaned heavily on the stuff that gets built up inside the neck of the bottle and in the top of in the cap there, because that has a little bit more texture to it. And you want that extra layer of texture when you're rusting out corrosion like this. I'm wet blending those 2 effects together. That's what I really like about enamels, is that you can wet blend them like this. Just gives it a little bit more of a cohesive look and feel as you put it on. And then finally, I'm going to add some black oil paint to the end of the exhaust pipe. That's going to simulate the soot and smoke that gets spit out of those things. One more rust effect I'm going to do here is I'm going to hit the business end of the shovel and the axe and the sledgehammer here with a little bit of that enamel rust wash, just to kind of give it a little bit of a worn look. And then I'm also going to come back and give those tools some metallic highlights. By far the most time-consuming part of the weathering process on this model is the dust, dirt, and mud effects. I really want this thing to look filthy, like it's been plowing along those dirt logging roads in the Ardennes forest in late 1944. So I started with AK dry ground acrylic terrain paste, but I didn't love the texture that it gave it. However, it did help create an additional layer of dust effect on here, so it wasn't a total loss. But because I didn't love the terrain paste that I used, I came back with a mud slurry that I made with dark earth pigment and enamel wash. And then I put it on the tank in the areas where the mud really would get built up as it traveled over those forest roads. I also used a little bit of the Ammo by MIG enamel mud products, namely turned earth and wet ground, to kind of augment that slurry and some of the patchy mud splotches around the tank. With that mud slurry paste on there, I came back with Europe Earth, which is kind of a lighter colored pigment, and started to blend it in with the mud slurry. That helps give it a little bit more texture, and it also creates a better variety of dirt, dust coloring around there, just to help elevate that earth weathering effect, giving it some tonal variety and a little bit more of a realistic look. I did kind of the same process with the wheels, blending the pigments and the mud slurry to give it some really dirty looking blend with caked on mud and dried dirt. With the tracks, I started with that same acrylic dry terrain paste and cleaned it off the cleats right away while it was still using a wet Q-tip here. I ended up using my slurry mix and some of those same enamel mud products because I felt that they gave it a little bit better effect, a little more controllable effect, I should say, where I'm smashing that mud and dirt down into the tracks. And again, after applying that, clean off those cleats. You want to make sure those cleats don't have too much mud and dirt on them, because as the tank moves, that's where the metal parts get polished as it kind of goes along. So, and you'll see this here at the end. I'm going to come back and hit that with some metallic effects. Another thing I did with the tracks is I added some fake grass. Actually, it's tiny little pieces of twine that I've cut and sprinkled it into that mud slurry mess that I made here on the tracks to kind of help give it that extra layer of effect to kind of simulate where it's going through the forest and taking out plant life as it goes along. To finish off the dirt, dust, and mud application process here, I came back and hit it with the splatter effects. To start with, I used the darker colored enamel mud from MIG turned earth product, splattered that around the tank. Try to control it a little bit. I think it's, you can always wipe it off, but I would rather just kind of start with a light application and build it up as opposed to go heavy-handed with it and then come back and try to clean it up. With the darker one applied, then I came back with the dry earth splashes and hit that around there. And that gives it kind of 2 different layers of splatter effects, some simulating wetter mud that's been recently added to there, and then some representing dry mud that's just kind of built on there and dried off in the process. One finishing touch with the dirt, dust, and mud, after it had dried, I came back with some gloss varnish and just touched up a few of those muddy spots to help that wet effect kind of stand out a little bit more. I also came back with a chrome marker and added some highlights to the bolts on the wheels, and that just gives it a little extra pop of color, which kind of represents the places where the dirt, mud, and paint gets scraped off as the tank moves along. And then you can't forget the spare tracks. I painted those with some dark gray, dark rust colored base. Came back and hit it with some enamel rust washes, then got it on the dirt effect with some pigment on there and glued them on the side of the turret. There's a couple more steps left on this model that you're not going to see here because I haven't done them yet. And that's adding a commander who's going to be sticking out of the cupola, and I'm going to add 2 soldiers standing around on the tank. Once I get those guys on there, I'm going to come back in and add the machine gun to the turret and add a few items of stowage to give it some extra detail. But I didn't want to add those things until I got the figures kind of locked in place so that I didn't run into any, issues with that. And that is the complete weathering process with the King Tiger tank here. I really do like this kit. I highly recommend it. It's from Rye Field Models. It came out last year, 2024. It's kit number 5125 if you're looking for it. A lot of detail, goes together really nicely. If you have questions or comments on the weathering process you just saw here, be sure to leave those in the comments. Be sure to check out the other videos I did with this tank, the painting process for the 3-tone camo, as well as the chipping process. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for lots more modeling content.